Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to HudsonAlpha U, and specifically the HudsonAlpha U, all about understanding the genetics of ancestry. I want to say welcome to everybody who's in the room here tonight, but also folks that might be watching online. So that everybody knows we are recording this so that it will be available online for you to watch later or for you to share with other people, because this is a really, this is a topic with lots of interest. We have been blown away by the response, by the number of people in the room here tonight, and we are just thrilled and humbled by that. But for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Kelly East, and I get the immense pleasure of being the Vice President for Educational Outreach here at HudsonAlpha, which I think is the best job in the world. And HudsonAlpha U, you probably know, or else you might not have come tonight, something you didn't know what you were getting into. But HudsonAlpha U is a new program that we started this year as an opportunity for us to get together, community members and us at HudsonAlpha, and talk about genetics and talk about how DNA affects ourselves, our lives, and the world around us. And so tonight's all about ancestry. There's faces here that I know well, but there's also new faces in the audience as well, and I'm really excited about that. And I hope that if this is your first time here for HudsonAlpha U or your first time at HudsonAlpha, that it will not be your last. Before we jump in, I want to say a big thank you to the sponsors tonight, to the Ashburn Foundation, our own Alumni Association, which we'll talk about at the end, is a way that the community supports our work in education, and also the Jackson Center for everything they do to support this program and let us have this event tonight. So let's dive in. Ancestry genetics is something that people have lots of interest in, evidenced by the number of people that are here tonight. But read the statistic with me. More than 26 million people across the globe have swabbed their cheek or spit in a tube and sent it off and gotten ancestry information back about themselves. Lots and lots of people are really interested in ancestry genetics. Tonight we're going to talk about the science behind it. We're also going to talk about some of the things that kind of testing can tell you, maybe some of the pitfalls too. This is not a commercial for ancestry genetic testing, but it's also not a word of warning where I'm trying to tell everyone to go out there and never do this. But to think about what is this testing and what are the reasons people do and don't dig into the genetics of ancestry. But the ancestry genetics has been kind of around ever since we've known how to study genetics. The first ancestry genetic test that people could order actually hit the market in the year 2000. And for anyone who has tracked kind of the Human Genome Project, we sequenced a human for the first time. That was finished in 2003. So actually the first ancestry genetic test hit the market before we had fully sequenced the human genetic code. So it's been around for a little while, but looking at this graph here, you can see, this is 2013 right here, that it has exploded over the last few years of the number of people that are doing this type of testing. In large part because the technology's gotten better, the tests have gotten cheaper, and there's a really easy barrier, or there's a very low barrier to entry for people to kind of engage in this, and it gives you compelling information about yourself. And so why are people so interested in ancestry genetics? And I'm going to flash up some reasons on the screen. Maybe those of you in the room who have done this kind of testing can kind of attach to one of these and say, yeah, that's the main reason that I pursued digging into my ancestry. But this is based on surveys where they asked a whole bunch of people, why would you consider doing this? The biggest one, something like 60% or more of people that do ancestry genetic testing is for this reason here, is to further their genealogical research. Maybe they've been doing that the traditional way, digging up records, and they've hit a dead end that they're trying to get past. Or maybe they're starting with DNA and they haven't done a bunch of genealogy research, but they're wanting to dig into that and figure out where they came from, who their relatives are, and their kind of ancestral background. Another reason is to identify relatives or clarify relationships. Figuring out who is in your family tree. There's a lot of interest, especially in communities of individuals who are adopted, of figuring this out, and people who don't have a lot of information, this is a great way to start digging into that. Also, some people will do ancestry testing to prove, and notice I put this in quotes, to prove group membership, of trying to figure out, should I identify with population group X or Y. We'll talk about as we go through tonight how this type of testing in the science, it's good science, but it's not 100% accurate science. It's all based on estimations, probabilities, right? And so you can't necessarily prove anything 100%, but you can get clues to that, and some people might use that to shape their identity. Some people do ancestry testing not for the ancestry information, but maybe they're actually interested in their health or their traits, right? But to do that testing, they get the ancestry information as a bonus. That maybe that's not the reason they're doing it, but it just kind of comes along with the other information they're trying to get from their DNA. Some people do this testing because it's less about themselves and more about wanting to help others, that they know that maybe the company that they're ordering testing from, or maybe they're enrolling in a research study, that they're hoping that their participation and them getting this information will help move science forward, whether that's the science of populations and ancestry, or whether that's the science of health or anything else. But it's kind of that altruistic motivation of doing ancestry testing. And then finally, there's people that are just curious naturally about life. They're kind of your early adopters that want to do anything that's new, and we'll give them some new information. So those are a whole bunch of reasons people do this kind of testing. But on the flip side, that 26 million, that's a lot of people that have done testing, but that's not everybody, right? There's people who haven't done ancestry genetic testing, and maybe that's passive, they just haven't gotten around to it, haven't thought about it, or it might be active where they're saying, no, I am explicitly not interested in getting this information about myself. So some of the reasons there, general disinterest, maybe they're too busy, they don't have time, and they just don't care a whole lot. They're just not interested. There's individuals who say, well, why would I want to know about my ancestry for my DNA if I already know it? Maybe they are that whiz genealogist and they've gotten it all figured out. And so they think, well, that can't really add a lot to what I already know. Or maybe they know their ancestry from genealogy, and maybe they're a little bit afraid that by digging into their DNA that it might be in conflict with that identity and what they know. And that might be unappealing to some people. Some people think, well, that's not relevant to me. There's the study that I was reading and pulling these from, there was a great quote from somebody that said, well, I don't care about DNA because that's not who makes me who I am. I am who I am, and what matters is what I'm doing today, not what's in the past. They just aren't interested in having their past shape their current and their future identities. Some people want more information. Maybe they're skeptical. Maybe they think, well, that's interesting, but I don't know that I know enough to say, yes, that's accurate, or that's not scary, or that might not harm me, that they're in this place of maybe someday, but not right now, because I don't know enough information to make an informed decision. Totally fair. One of the take-home messages here is make sure you've got all the information before you swab your cheek and send it in, right? Some folks might say, well, the testing that I order, maybe I'm worried about opening Pandora's box. If I do this test, and maybe it's a test that does include some of that other health information, and they don't want that, right? They might be okay learning about ancestry, but they're not interested in potentially doing a test that would tell them about some risk of disease in the future, and that keeps them from engaging in that test or digging into it further. And there's also concerns out there, we'll cover this in a little while as well, about privacy of digging into ancestry genetic testing usually means ordering a commercial test from a commercial company. And what does that mean in terms of your information being out there? Who's it being shared with? What's it being used for? And that can keep people from engaging in this as well. None of these are better than another, and as you've gone through that, you might have said, yeah, I kind of fit in that box and that box and that box. And whether or not people want to do this kind of testing, depends on how they weigh these different boxes together, and whether or not the pros outweigh the cons. When asked a whole bunch of people kind of what do you think about, there's this term, and you may see this on a few slides, that says DTC. DTC stands for direct to consumer. If anybody in the room has done ancestry genetic testing, I'll fully disclose that I have. I didn't have to go to a doctor to get that done. I could go online, order it myself, and that is one of what we consider direct to consumer testing. There's a relationship between a company and a customer, and there's not a healthcare provider anywhere in that mix. Because for most, in many cases, I might not say most, getting ancestry results doesn't affect your health, although there's some tests that have those bundles, right? So that's starting to get a little bit blurry. But this was a study where they asked a whole bunch of people, how much do you think that this kind of testing can provide you useful or interesting information about the following things? And unsurprisingly, ancestry, ancestral background, and family relationships are at the top of that list. That is the reason that most people are interested in digging into the DNA from an ancestry side of things. Certainly, managing health is up here, personal traits, infidelity is over here on this side. We'll cover that in a little while too. So remember this statistic that most people were very little concerned about infidelity, right? Okay, foreshadowing is what that is. All right, so let's talk about I've said the word ancestry probably 150 times in the 10 minutes I've been talking, but let's talk about what ancestry is. And ancestry falls into two different categories, and a lot of times we use the word ancestry without qualifying which one we're talking about, but they're very different. So the first category of ancestry is genealogical ancestry. That is your family tree. Who is on your tree and how are you connected? The people that your ancestors, your parents, your grandparents, the people that are connected to you through your family tree. That is your genealogical ancestry. When you're doing genealogy research, you're trying to put that puzzle together. The other kind of ancestry that we're going to talk about, and where DNA comes into play, is genetic ancestry. And that is about tracing not your family tree, but actually tracing the DNA that's inside your cells and where it came from, who it came from, how those sections of DNA have been passed through your family. And one of the critical things to keep in mind is that these are not the same. And that there are people on your family tree, and it's not because of that infidelity thing, there are people on your family tree that you don't actually share genetic material with, just because of the random way that DNA kind of mixes together and gets passed through generations. And we're going to talk about that science. But that there are people in your family tree that you don't share DNA with means that you can't necessarily do genetic testing and figure out everybody in your family tree, right? And if you could compare your DNA to somebody who you definitely are related to and not share DNA with them, that can go kind of both ways. All right, we've got to talk about DNA, right? We're here to talk about the genetics of ancestry. So go with me for a minute back to biology class, because we're going to be talking about genes and DNA and chromosomes, because we're going to talk about how exactly it can be that you've got people you're related to that you don't actually share DNA with. So our DNA is the instruction book of life, right? Every single cell that makes up our bodies has an entire instruction book for life inside of it. You've got all of your DNA inside of every single one of your cells. DNA, if you remember, is made up of these 4 letters right here, A, C, T, G, about 6 billion of them in each one of your cells. But ultimately, that DNA is wound up really, really tightly into these structures right here called chromosomes. We're going to say that word a lot tonight, too. So we've got all these chromosomes that are ultimately made up of long, long strands of DNA. And your DNA is organized into these sections that are called genes that code for specific things, right? Those are individual recipes. All of your chromosomes are a cookbook. You can kind of work with that analogy, right? All right. So the human genome is big. We have, so this says 3 billion base, it's 3 million bases. We've got 6 million base pairs because you've got half from mom and half from dad. And inside all of our DNA in our cells, we've got 25,000 genes, lots of information, right? And they're organized into 46 chromosomes. So those are the structures that hold the DNA. You may or may not have seen one of these kind of pictures before. This is what we call a karyotype. This is a picture of a whole bunch of chromosomes. If you were to take all the chromosomes out of a human cell and line them all up side by side, this is what it would look like. They're not nearly this pretty or organized inside our cells. But you notice you've got 2 copies of every single one of those chromosomes. One that you got from your mom and the other that you got from your dad. So the information, so up here we've got chromosome number 1, and you've got a chromosome number 1 that you inherited from one parent and a chromosome number 1 you inherited from the other parent. The DNA on those chromosomes are very similar. They code for the same things, but there might be slight differences between the two because your mom's DNA and your dad's DNA are slightly different, okay? So we've got 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, and 22 of those pairs have numbers under them. And we call those numbered chromosomes this really big word right here called autosomes. And if you've explored ancestry genetic testing, that's probably a term you've bumped into. Because there's a big deal about what an autosomal genetic test is versus things that aren't looking at your autosomes. But autosomes are your numbered chromosomes where you have a matching pair, one from mom and one from dad. The things that are not autosomes are right here. These are the sex chromosomes. That either individuals are either XX or they're XY. If you have an X and an X, then you're a, anybody know? Female, yeah. If you're XY, then you are a male, okay? So it's important to keep in mind autosomes, all the numbered chromosomes versus those sex chromosomes that are X and Y. A couple notes about the Y chromosome that are really interesting. The Y chromosome, you can see right here, it is much, much smaller than the X chromosome. It's about a third of the size, and it has way fewer genes on it. It's got 100 genes versus 900 genes-ish that are over on the X chromosome. So a lot less information. There are some pieces of the Y chromosome that are similar to the X because it is important that those two can find each other, right? So there's got to be a little bit of them that match so that they can find each other when the cell is dividing, but most of the Y chromosome is unique to the Y. The other thing I want to point out, because it'll come up later, is that there's a little piece up here on the Y chromosome called SRY. And that is the piece of the Y that determines and makes someone be a male. Having an SRY makes a person male. That region is the sex-determining region. The genes that are in there are what controls that. That'll be important in a little while. The other place that we have DNA inside our cells, so let me go back. All of this DNA right here, these 46 chromosomes that are in every single one of our cells, they are hanging out inside this nucleus up here. That's the part of the cell where our DNA is. And usually when you talk about DNA, that's the part of the DNA we're talking about, is the stuff that's in the nucleus. However, people don't always talk about it because it's complicated and hard, that we have DNA also inside these structures right here in the cell that are called the mitochondria. I promise we'll get out of Biology 101 in a minute. But the mitochondria are structures that are inside, so this is one big cell, right? So they're inside our cells. They're like the energy producers for your cell. They make energy. But inside the mitochondria, it has its own strand of DNA. that is circular. It's like one circle chromosome that's over there in the mitochondria. And you notice in the cell, there's actually multiple mitochondria in a single cell, and they each have this strand of DNA. However, we don't talk about this a whole lot because it's tiny, the amount of DNA. So only about 1% of your DNA is in a mitochondria. The other 99% is up there in your nucleus. So that's the part that we talk about mostly. But this has a really important part of the ancestry genetics story, this mitochondrial DNA. So when we think about where our DNA is and what you can test, you can dig into the DNA inside your nucleus that includes all of those autosomes and then the X and the Y, although only males are going to have Y chromosomes. And you've got DNA in the mitochondria. So how does this DNA get passed down from generation to generation? This picture up here, this is a pedigree. This is kind of like that family tree, that genealogical ancestry, right, where you can track who's related to who. And if we have a person right here, also to orient you to pedigrees, squares are typically drawn as males and circles are drawn as females. So here we've got a male individual, and then going up from him, you've got his parents, his dad, and his mom, and then each of them have parents, and each of them have parents. This is the most simple pedigree, right? Everybody only had one child, a very, however, so if we look up here, and this is also very simple in that each one of these, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents of this individual, it's color-coded. And so when we think about that autosomal DNA, that DNA that's in the nucleus, that's the numbered chromosomes, which is most of our DNA, it gets passed down in a very typical kind of 50% from mom, 50% from dad fashion. Because what happens is we get one copy of each of those chromosomes from each parent, and that is 50%. So as you go through here, and just by using color coding, you can see that this next generation is kind of half and half. Half DNA from mom, half DNA from dad. And then you go to the next generation though, and now these people have this combination of 25% of all of their grandparents. And you go on to our guy down here at the bottom, and he is an eighth of all of his great-grandparents, theoretically, right? That he inherited that much DNA from each of them, ish, right? But this is, you talk about being half from mom, half from dad, that's all the autosomal DNA that we're talking about, and you're expecting it to follow these patterns. But it gets a little bit more interesting when you think about Y chromosomes and mitochondria. So the Y chromosome is only present in males, and where did those males get their Y chromosome? Their dad, right? And where did he get it? His dad, and so on and so on. And so you have this Y chromosome genetic information that gets passed down in a very different fashion from male to male to male to male, right? And so by this person right here digging into his Y chromosome DNA and seeing what's in there, he can tell a lot about this whole paternal lineage, right? All the way back to, at some point, a single male that was the predecessor of all males on the planet. So Y chromosome DNA comes through from male to male, and then mitochondrial DNA does something different. So mitochondria that have DNA inside of them, right? Your mitochondria come entirely from your mother. Not because it has anything to do with the X chromosome. Nothing to do with it, right? Because males and females have X's, right? It's not that the X's only come from mom. That's not how that works. But what happens is those mitochondria are only present in eggs during fertilization. They come by way of the egg, not the sperm. So therefore, a person, whether you're male or female, your mitochondrial DNA came from and was inherited from your mother and her mother and so on and so on. And so, but in a similar fashion that you can track paternal lineage through looking at Y chromosomes, you can look at the mitochondrial DNA sequence and track back maternal lineages. But you notice this is still a guy right here at the bottom of the screen, who everybody has mitochondria, male, female alike. We all have mitochondria, but our mitochondria came from our mom. Keep in mind that our DNA, whether it's mitochondrial DNA or the DNA in our nucleus, is by and large the same between people. If we were to sequence two of the most unrelated people on the planet, they're going to be 99.9% the same. So when we talk about finding genetic variation and looking at differences that tell us about ancestry, we're digging into that tiny 0.1% of DNA that's different between human beings. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that DNA, as we go from generation to generation, that the DNA kind of mixes itself up. It's really important for genetic diversity on the planet, right? That when I pass on a chromosome to my children, that they don't get an entire chromosome that was either my mom's or my dad's. They get a chromosome from me that is a mixture of both of my parents. And the way that works is with every generation, as we are creating what we call gametes, egg and sperm cells, as we're creating those, there's this process called crossing over that occurs between my two. We'll just use chromosome number 1, for example. I have 2 chromosome number 1s. And when during that process, those 2 chromosome 1s, that one came from my mom and one came from my dad, they swap information back and forth so that ultimately the cells, the gametes, the egg or sperm cells that are produced from that have a combination of information from my mom and my dad inside each of those chromosomes that might get passed on to the next generation. So let's see what that looks like in this very simplified graphic up on the screen. So here we've got 2 chromosomes. We're going to say that they're chromosome number 1, right? And so you've got 2 there. They're a little different shades of blue. Let's say one was inherited on the darker blue one was the chromosome that was inherited from a father, and the other one was inherited from a mother. When this individual, when their body goes through this meiosis process where they're creating egg or sperm cells, they've got 2 copies of every chromosome, but those egg or sperm cells only need 1, because then when it gets fertilized, right, you need to go back to the number 2. And so each egg and sperm cell only has 1 copy of every chromosome, so that when they join together, you get back to the typical number of 2. Otherwise, every single generation would have twice as much genetic material as the previous generation, and that wouldn't go well, right? So what happens is the first thing that happens is that these 2 chromosomes up here, they're actually going to copy each other or copy themselves, which seems counterintuitive if the goal is to have less. But they first copy themselves, but then they're going to go through 2 separate rounds of division. So you end up with 4 daughter cells that each have 1. But like I said, they don't just simply say, okay, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's this process of crossing over that happens where they line up, they find each other, and then they swap information back and forth. This will happen usually at least once within a chromosome. It could happen multiple places along the chromosome. But they swap information, and so then ultimately when they divide and create these 4 daughter cells, can you see the differences in color up here? That each one of those daughter cells has a combination of those 2 chromosomes. But it's random, but it's different. And so then, if any one of these were to then, let's say goes through fertilization and has another chromosome that comes in, the resulting offspring, the child, if they inherit this chromosome, that they've inherited this entire chromosome from this parent, but the amount of the DNA that came from that parent's mom or dad is different than if it was this person or this person or this person. These could be 4 different siblings that inherited different sets of information from their grandparents. Right? Yeah. And then let's say this individual then goes on and has their cells duplicate and divide, and you're bringing in yet another, the chromosome that they inherited from their other parent, and we're going to go through the process again. Maybe. Yeah. And so now we've got the next generation, you've got new information that's come in, and you've got some of those original 2 chromosomes in the mix as well. And this goes on and on and on. We started with solid chromosomes, right? As if that's where this family just started out of nowhere, right? But you can imagine over time, you know, that you've got inside your DNA little bits from all kinds of people in your family tree behind you. But comparing yours to a sibling's or a cousin's might be really different just because of the random way that DNA, that crossing over where it shares genetic information, and what gets passed, which chromosomes get passed down. All right, so we're going to pretend for a moment, at least those of us in the room, those of you at home can pretend along in the way as well, that we are all in the biggest family reunion ever, okay? And we are all cousins of each other. A lot of cousins. That we are all cousins of each other. We are all kind of hanging out down here in this generation, and we have a grandfather up here, great-grandfather up here, that had these chromosomes, this complement right here of colors. And this went through 3 different generations. So here's us down here. We've got our parents, we've got our grandparents, and we've got this great-granddad up here. And our question is, how much DNA did I get from great-granddad compared to you? Right? So what I would love for you to do, those of you that are in the room, is you kind of bookmark when you came in tonight. And I hope you'll take this home and you can remember HudsonAlpha when you read, but I want you to flip it over. And on the back, you're going to see, I hope, you're going to see a chromosome. And I'd love for you to look at it and then turn to the person next to you and compare. And for those of you that are watching this at home and don't have a bookmark to hold in your hand, and those of you who are watching at home and don't have one of these to hold, up here on the screen are a whole bunch of options that were on the back of these bookmarks that folks are holding in the room. Were they different from the people next to you? I sure hope so. Now, I will fully own the fact that we did not produce 400 different bookmarks. Pictures. There are 100 different varieties that are out there. But so you might have had a whole bunch of really dark blue on your chromosome, or you might be some of you that had none. You might have a whole bunch of different bands of different individuals that you got DNA on this chromosome from, or you might have fewer. And this is a simple kind of exercise where I went through and used an Excel random number generator to figure out all the different ways this could go. But I said, let's just have it do crossing over where it swaps information one time each generation. In reality, it can happen multiple times along a single chromosome. But this is how that if you do ancestry genetic testing and you've got others maybe in your family that do as well, that you might get results that are different from each other. And that doesn't mean that you're not related, and it doesn't mean that the science or the test is wrong necessarily, that we our DNA, as it passes through the family, right, that it can get distributed in different ways, in different percentages, and it can lead to different results. So, yeah. So how does genetic testing work for ancestry? So part of the reason that this kind of testing is really popular is because it's really easy, honestly, that individuals can go online to a number of sources and they can order themselves an ancestry genetic test. They go in, they order, like I said, you don't have to have a doctor involved in that. They get a kit, usually it gets mailed to their house, and then they have to go on and register that kit to say, hey, this kit is me. When you get it back in the lab, this is me. And then they give their sample. Usually it's either a cheek swab or a spit test, depending on what company it is, and that gets sent back to the lab. The lab does the actual genetic testing. We'll talk in a minute about what the type of testing that is, but they do genetic testing. They look at the DNA of the sample that you sent in, and then a couple weeks later, you're probably going to get an email that says your results are ready, where you can click a link and go into their portal online and look at your results and explore them. So really simple and a very straightforward process for people to do. So what is the testing that's done? When you order ancestry testing, usually what is behind the scenes is something called a genotyping test. And let's talk about what genotyping means. So this is a book, because we're going to stick with this analogy, right, of our DNA being a recipe book or an instruction manual. And there's a whole bunch of A's, T's, C's, and G's up on these pages. And so to do a genetic test, the purpose there is to try to figure out, what are your A's, T's, C's, and G's, and what order are they in? Sometimes when we do a genetic test, we do what we call a sequencing test, where you're actually reading the DNA code, like you would open a book and you would read it. That would be sequencing, and you can do small sequencing tests that just look at a certain part of the book, or you can do a really big test that's called whole genome sequencing, where you're reading your entire book or anywhere in between. But usually these ancestry tests don't do this. They're not reading all of your genetic code. They do genotyping, which is a lot like a spot check of sorts. Like if I was going to proofread a book, one option is I could read the whole book. Another option is I can say, I'm just going to look at every 10 words and see if they're spelled correctly. That's kind of what we're doing with genotyping. Not the proofreading tactic I would suggest if your goal is to proofread the book. But in this case, these laboratories, they know where in your book they need to look. They know what spots to go look at to be able to get the information that they're wanting to get about your ancestry. So they know where to look, so they can build a test that just goes and looks at those places. And it's a much more simple, it's a lot cheaper, and a lot easier to analyze this kind of testing. And so this is the type of test that they're doing. The chip that they use, let me go back. It's kind of on a micro, it's on a chip here where they have all of they put the patient sample or the customer sample on it, and there's all these spots on here where it's already targeted that it can determine what kind of letter, do you have an A, a T, a C, or a G at all of these different places. And it's something about 600,000 different locations in your genome that they're looking at currently with the tests that are on the market right now. So they do this genotyping test, and what they're looking for are certain areas in your genetic code that, based on what your DNA says, it gives them clues as to where, what populations you might have inherited DNA from, or that you're similar to. So they pick spots in the genome, the spots in your DNA, that based on what letter you have, it makes it more likely that you have inherited DNA from population group X or population group Y. These areas of our genome that have it's kind of like having different flavors, right? And one's not better than the other. And a lot of times these differences don't even have a consequence in terms of health. There's just differences. But there's different flavors that exist out there in the wild, and we call them SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. That's a huge, huge word. But if you start digging in and looking at ancestry tests, you'll stumble into that word as well. But these SNPs are single DNA letter changes that are, they're not the same across the entire population on the planet. And different population groups have certain SNPs that are more common. So for example, here's 3 different types of SNPs down here. And this is a really complicated graphic, but what I want you to see is that this top row, these are all areas in the DNA where, based on what letter you have, are more common in people of African ancestry versus changes down here that are more common in people of East Asian or European. And so at the end of the day, though, by looking and saying, okay, in this allele right here, if I am, let's do this one right here. If I have a G and an A, then half the people of East Asian background have a G and an A right there. Everybody else on the planet pretty much has 2 Gs. Okay? Now, having a G or an A makes no difference in terms of health or anything like that, but by looking at that, by seeing an A there, makes me think, hey, this person quite possibly has East Asian background. Now, could you make that estimate based on one spot in the DNA? No, but they're looking at 600,000 spots in the DNA. And if you look at enough of those, you can start to piece it together and say, okay, this looks like the profile of someone who has DNA that is shared with people in the following areas of the planet. The reason they know that? Well, because they've done a bunch of testing in people from those areas that they can compare your or the customer's data to. But really what they're doing with this, they call them ancestry tests, and they are, but what these tests are really doing is looking at genetic similarity, how much your DNA is similar to these certain populations that are predefined, that they've got data that they can compare you to. So they're looking at genetic similarity. That's really what's underneath this testing, and they're using that to kind of extrapolate your ancestry information from there. But they're not actually tracing your DNA back through time. They're comparing your DNA today to a whole bunch of databases and people that they've tested that they know where they are from, and seeing how similar it is. So here's a couple example reports. This is a example report looking at ethnicity estimates. This is DNA from those autosomes, right? This is from those numbered chromosomes, and the report out. This is an example report that I pulled from the 23andMe website, but you can see what this person has learned is that they are about 47% European, or at least that's probably what they're going to tell you their result means. I did my result. It told me I'm 47% European, I'm 41% East Asian, 5% Sub-Saharan African. What this is telling them is that their DNA is that much similar to the databases of people, right, that are from those areas. And so there's a pretty strong probability that they have ancestors, maybe way back when, that were in these different areas. Another way that they'll show this, another readout that you can get from ancestry testing, is something called chromosome painting. And so here they actually have the pictures of the chromosomes. This is chromosomes 16 through 22, but they actually have the sections color-coded based on that particular area of the chromosome and what population that area matched the most, kind of giving you the same information just in a slightly different way. But some of these companies do a nice job of visually trying to show what they learned about your DNA. Like what came off that machine when they do the test was a text file with 600,000 A's, T's, C's, or G's, right? And then these companies do a whole bunch of work to make sense of that and turn it into something really pretty, right, that is interesting to look at and can tell you information that is informative and interesting. Another big thing these companies do, and a big reason some people do this testing, is to find relatives. So you can, these companies, the genetic ancestry testing companies, have databases, right? If you've done testing with that company, they have your information. And assuming you maybe opted in to relative finding, other people who do that test, if they are related to you, you would pop up as a relative match. It's important to note, though, that a lot of these companies keep their own databases, right? And so you're only going to match with people who have had testing with that particular company. So some people actually will order testing from multiple companies if this is really what they're trying to do, because they might find a relative with this company that they don't find with this other one. But when it works really similarly with a lot of the companies where it'll tell you, here's these relatives, here's our predicted relationship, so a mother or a father, where it might say something like, this is probably a second to fourth cousin. Right? The way that they do that is they say, well, you share DNA with this person. And based on how much DNA you share, depends on how far apart you are in that family tree. And when you get kind of further out, they may not know, but you're somewhere in that range, right? And so you can find relatives this way. Another in this column, just kind of an interesting fun fact, is they have this result here for each of these relatives called shared CM, and CM stands for centimorgan. Centimorgans is a unit of measurement that you've probably never heard of, but centimorgans are named after this guy right here, Thomas Hunt Morgan. He was a geneticist. He won the Nobel Prize in 1933. He won the Nobel Prize because he discovered, and he's the person who hypothesized that genes are lined up on a chromosome sequentially, right? Important. Important to this whole concept of DNA moving from generation to generation. But the centimorgan is a unit of measurement that looks at how far apart areas are in the DNA and says and calculates how likely it is that those two areas would get separated by that crossing over event. If they're really close together, it's not real likely they're going to get separated. But if those genes are really far apart, there's a pretty high likelihood that they might get separated in the next generation. Okay. But that's why it's called a centimorgan. But generally speaking, one centimorgan is about 1 million DNA letters. So if we go back and you've got these relatives here, this individual and their mother shared 3,000 centimorgans. A lot, right? Approximately half of their DNA, right, is their parent, half, right? And the other half is shared with their dad. But you get down here to the second to fourth cousin, and they're only sharing 58 centimorgans. And so that's part of how they figure out how closely related are you, is how much DNA, how many sections of DNA, and how long are they that you share, between you and that other person. Okay. So that's the ancestry information, the autosomal data that you can get back. That autosomal data, most of our DNA, right, the numbered chromosomes, that's the data that helps give you those ethnicity estimates of what populations you are potentially inherited DNA from. You also, depending on what company you use and where you get testing from, you can get information about your Y haplotype and your mitochondrial DNA. And those get reported out as a haplogroup. It's a really big words, right? But haplogroups tell you what branch your either Y chromosome information or your mitochondrial information, what branch of that it is, right? We talked about that Y chromosomes are tracked through paternal lineages, and the mitochondrial DNA comes from your maternal lineage. That DNA doesn't do that crossing over bit, right? It doesn't do that swap and sharing of information from one generation to the next, because males, well, you've got one Y chromosome. There's not another one that it can swap information with. Those get passed down kind of in whole from generation to generation, unless there are small changes that just get introduced by random chance. Mutations can happen, and they do happen. And when that occurs, if a genetic change gets introduced, then everybody from that person on down is going to have that same genetic change. And so you can end up with these kind of branching trees of haplogroups based on, you've got this one right here that's kind of the ancient origin, but then every time there's genetic changes that get introduced, it creates a new branch on that haplotype tree. This is an example of a mitochondrial result that you can get. And the Y chromosome works the same way, where you have this branching tree, and it'll tell you which one of those branches, either your Y chromosome information if you're a male, or your mitochondrial DNA, which of those haplotypes you belong to. And it'll kind of help give you some information about how we think that haplogroup has kind of migrated over time from ancient days to current. This point, we kind of drove home with the bookmark example that you can have relatives that are very closely related that have different ancestry results, and that includes siblings. And there's, I've heard people say before, well, you know, me and my sibling both did ancestry genetic testing, and it must be wrong because clearly we have the same ancestry as each other. We've got the same parents, the same grandparents, but it told me that I am more French or Irish or whatever than my sibling. And how can that be? Well, the answer to that is because yes, you both inherited half of your DNA from your mom or your dad, but not necessarily the same parts of the DNA were inherited that you got versus your sibling. And you might have just happened to have gotten more of the Irish or the French or the Chinese or the African or whatever it is, parts of that DNA compared to your sibling. The other point that is really important to make is that you know, this is all the results that you get from ancestry testing. It's going to vary depending on what lab you send it to and when you send it in time. If I had testing 10 years ago versus today, my results might be different. Now, has my ancestry changed in 10 years? No, right? Like that is what it is, but the results may be quite different because the science has gotten better. The databases that they're using today are very different than the databases they were using then, and maybe the way they were calculating things. And so the results from ancestry testing is an estimate. It's a prediction, it's a probability. They are not doing some accurate science, right, that says, you know, we know for sure that this piece of your DNA was passed from this person to this person to this person, right? They're comparing you to the databases and trying to make some predictions. And that is going to vary over time and vary between different companies. So there have been people that have done studies where they've sent their own sample to a whole bunch of different companies and gotten different results. And again, are saying, well, what, is this all wrong? No, but every company does things a little bit differently. And especially when we think about databases, there are populations that are more well sampled than others. This is a graph of people in databases, and you see this giant blue section? That's Europeans. So what does that tell you about the results that you get if your results are based on this database? That it's going to be more accurate, right, and more clear for people who are represented in the database. And there are lots of populations that are woefully unrepresented in databases. Another thing that I'll hear sometimes is people will say, well, I've had ancestry genetic testing, and I know for a fact that I'm Native American, that I identify with that group, I can track how my ancestry from a genealogical perspective tracks back to Native American populations, but I did my genetic testing and it said I wasn't Native American. So it is, and we talk about, well, what are the reasons for that? One is, well, maybe that was not the correct identity and population group. Maybe there's something wrong in that genealogical narrative, but also it might be right, because one of the population groups that is very poorly represented in databases are Native populations. There's a lot of skepticism, and in many cases for good reason, among underrepresented groups to engage in genetic research and give samples to research. And so, but if the population that you share a lot of DNA with is not in the database, it can't tell you that you are that, right? So you have to, when people do genetic testing and the results don't align with their kind of perceived identity, there's lots of reasons for that, and it's not, it isn't always either their identity perception was wrong or that the science is wrong. This was a fascinating article that I stumbled upon on the internet when I was digging stories up for this, and this is a set of twins. So twins share all of their DNA. So theoretically, they should have the same genetic and genealogical ancestries. But they ordered testing and they got slightly different results back. Their DNA is the same. But so this speaks to that the algorithms, and it's not a precise science, and that they're similar. They're for sure very similar, but the way that their samples were analyzed in the algorithms, and maybe some tiny subtle differences made a difference in the results that they got back.
Were those
Sure.
just twins, or were they supposedly identical twins?
So the question here was, were they fraternal or identical twins? I think, because fraternal twins are just like siblings. These were actually identical twins, and when they went and looked at the raw data in their samples, it was very, very similar. I mean, it was the same. And so it is a little bit of a question mark as to how they got different results, but it's fascinating. All right, we've gone through a ton. One thing I want to make sure we get to, because I don't want to keep you guys here all night, is I do want to tackle this topic of unexpected results. Yeah, we need to get there, right? And that when people do any kind of genetic testing, that you need to be prepared for those unexpected results. And honestly, with ancestry testing, maybe we shouldn't call them unexpected results, because the statistic on the next slide, 27% of people who did direct-to-consumer ancestry testing learned about a previously unknown close relative. It's 1 in... Yeah, it's 1 in 4, right? Yeah. Now, this can mean a lot of different things, but it's really, really important for people who are thinking about doing ancestry genetic testing to know about this as a very real possibility. And there are so many stories. You might have lived them. You might have heard them about people that have learned really life-altering information from doing this kind of genetic testing, and it can go a lot of different ways. There are stories of incredibly positive outcomes that can come from this, and on the flip side, there are stories of people whose lives have been turned completely upside down in a negative way based on information that has come to light from doing ancestry genetic testing. And it has that potential for removing branches from family trees, or adding branches to family trees, or rewriting a person's kind of family narrative, which can be really, really big. A couple stories of this that I will want to kind of highlight, and I'll tell these pretty quick. But if you start going and you can look online, you can find story after story after story of people that have learned really kind of shocking information from ancestry genetic testing and what it's meant for them and their families. So this first story, this was a girl who had ancestry testing. I'll make a note that her siblings gave this test to her as a gift for her birthday. Given to her as a gift for her birthday, and by doing this test, she found out that she was only a half sibling to her siblings, that they were all full siblings, but she had a different father. And you can read the headline here. It says, when a DNA test shatters your identity. And the story talks about what that meant for her and the loss of this family identity that she had. And it was an incredibly traumatizing, troubling experience for this individual who had no idea what she was getting herself into. This one is a story of a couple that had They had two children, and their younger child was conceived through IVF. And so the child was then 12, and they decided to order ancestry testing on both of their kids. And it turns out that the results came back that their second child that was conceived through IVF was not the child of the husband, the male partner. What happened was a sample swap in the IVF clinic, and a different sperm sample was used in that conception. So yeah, not what they were bargaining for when they were ordering testing for fun for their children. Ultimately, how the story goes, though, is that they told the son and had him involved in the decision of, are we going to go search for your biological dad? And he decided, yes, I would like to do that. And so they did. They went and they did a lot of sleuthing, and they found this couple that lived in another part of the country who got the surprise phone call that there is a child that he is the biological father for. Yes, mind blown. This is not the only story like this, but this story actually has a happy ending. These two families have kind of bonded, and they get together and hang out and have a very positive relationship after a pretty life-altering set of results that they got from ancestry testing. Finally, has anybody but me watched this documentary on Netflix? So this is a documentary, it's on Netflix, it's called Our Father. Or maybe you've heard the story or read the news headlines, because this is a true story. But the Cliffs Notes version is that there was a doctor in Indianapolis, a fertility doctor, who for decades, it appears, was using his own samples. Just leave it there. And when this was going on, we couldn't sequence a human genome at the time. This concept of that at some point this would all come to light was not there. But now all these people that were conceived at this fertility clinic with his sample are all having genetic testing, ancestry genetic testing, and finding each other. And I think when the documentary aired, the count was at 94. Yeah, 94. And there's all kinds of fascinating, every single person that they interview in that documentary has a fascinating story about what happened and what this meant for them. So those are 3 stories of countless stories of unexpected results that came from ancestry testing. The stories that you read about on the internet that make it to Netflix documentaries are usually really, really big, dramatic stories. But for every one of those, there are tons and tons more. I I'm going to skip over a couple of these slides because I want to make sure we get to the kind of take-home message. But ancestry testing isn't always just about ancestry. There are tests on the market that can tell you other stuff too, about your health, your future disease risks, what you're a carrier for. So maybe you don't have this disease, but you're at risk of passing it on to the next generation. There's some tests that'll bundle together pharmacogenetic information. If y'all were at my previous HudsonAlpha U, we talked all about that. But there's tests where you can get multiple of these things together. And it's important to know before you swab or spit what it is that you're getting, and are you motivated? Are you wanting all of that information back, and are you prepared to get it? I want to talk about privacy, kind of as we're wrapping up, and tell some stories here too. When earlier in the talk we talked about reasons people don't want to do ancestry testing, and privacy was one of the things that came up. And that there are definite privacy concerns that exist, that when you are putting your information out there and sharing that with other people, you lose control to some degree over your information. And so here's a couple of things to think about and ways that privacy intersects with ancestry testing. This is all from a CNBC article that talked through 5 risks that exist with ancestry testing. The first is hacking. Just like your bank account, your social security number, any of that is out there online, your genetic data is just as much at risk of getting compromised. And this is a story about one of the ancestry companies that had a recent breach where a lot of their customers' account information was compromised. Now, this particular example, the actual DNA data was not what was compromised. It was the patient's or the customer's, probably their credit cards and their personal information and all of that. But it brings to light this concept of, how secure is that data? These companies that do this as a business model are highly motivated to not get hacked, right? Like their business model is built on customer trust. And so they put lots and lots of safeguards in place, but nothing is foolproof. And there is a risk that if your genetic data is hanging out in the cloud storage of a company, that information could get compromised. Some of these companies also share information with others. And for some people, this might be a great reason they want to do the test in the first place. If they have that altruistic motivation, they're trying to contribute to science, they might be all for the company sharing their information with research groups, with companies, with pharmaceutical companies, you name it, if it can help others. That might be a pro. Other people, that concept might wig them completely out and say, no, I want my results back, but I'm not interested in my data getting shared with other people. And so many companies actually have a way for customers to opt in or opt out to their data getting shared. You might have to look in the really fine print to find it for some. But this is something that occurs. And I don't know about you, but I'm not real good at reading fine print. And I bet there's a lot of people that have undergone ancestry testing without reading fine print and probably couldn't tell you exactly what they did or didn't consent to in terms of data sharing. So genetic discrimination is a concept of your DNA being used against you, whether that is finding out that you have an increased risk for a disease and that being used to treat you differently. You could also imagine with ancestry testing a whole bunch of ways that genetic information could be used in a discriminatory way. There's some legislation out there. This is a picture of George Bush signing the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act into law back in 2008 that gives us some protections from genetic discrimination, but it's not perfect. These laws haven't been tested a whole lot, but there is just that worry of who has your information and what can they do with it. Law enforcement access. Did anybody in here follow the story of the Golden State Killer getting caught, finally, after all those years? Did you know that ancestry data helped them catch him? Yeah. Fascinating story. Now, the criminal here was not, He did not send off his ancestry DNA. That would probably not be a good idea. And it wasn't him that did. It was like a third cousin or somebody, right? And so, but what happened in this case was the law enforcement agencies, they had DNA from crime scenes. They had run it through all the typical databases and come up short, the actual forensic DNA databases. And so they turned to some ancestry databases, some third-party tools where people had uploaded their data into it, and they put the crime scene data in, and they got a match of a distant relative of the Golden State Killer. And then they did a whole bunch of sleuthing, right? And to figure out, okay, we know that the criminal is a X-degree relative of this person. And how do you work out the web from there? Like working out a giant puzzle. And they got him. And since this time, this was 2018, I think there's been at least 30 more cases solved in similar ways, which is fascinating. And probably for most of us in the room are like, yes, go science. Right? Yeah, like this is a good outcome. But it also brings up questions about, if my data's in there, how can it be used? Can they just go subpoena this and get access to it, and what might that mean for me? These companies, if you go on many of their websites, you'll actually see a whole area of the website where they try and be very transparent about every quarter how many requests they've gotten from law enforcement and like what have they done with it. Because, there's a point where they have to turn stuff over, but they require very rigorous, compelling requests that have to be subpoenaed. They're not just going to like pass it off to just anybody. But yeah, that if you are doing this kind of testing, your data could be used in this type of way. And then finally, just the concept that companies change, right? The companies, there are genetic testing companies that were on the market in 2010 that are no longer on the market. Company went under, company got sold. And what happens to the data when those things happen? Right? There's not even in a malicious way, just things change over time, and that landscape changes. And how is data protected, and how does your relationship with the data that's there, how does that change, and does that ever get severed where you don't have that control anymore? People tend to report that they're very worried about these things, that there's a lot of concern about failing to protect identity, sharing information without consent, and so on. So these concerns exist. Companies know this, and companies try to address many of these issues to the extent that they can. But clearly, there's lots of people that are still doing this kind of testing. They are able to overcome these concerns, maybe because their motivations outweigh the risks that exist. Like I said, this is not a commercial for ancestry testing at all, but this is just a breakdown of a number of the different companies that are some of the big players and some of the differences between them that I just wanted to call attention to. So Ancestry DNA is a big one. You've probably seen their advertisements, their commercials. They have the biggest databases of any of them. And they've got great links to their genealogy resources. One notable gap here, and for those that are watching this maybe not at the time that we're recording this live, this might not be accurate because things change. We just talked about it, companies change. But as of right now, you cannot get mitochondrial or Y information from Ancestry.com. They focus very much on that autosomal DNA. The other companies over here, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, you can get autosomal DNA, mitochondrial, and Y. One key difference between these two, though, is 23andMe, they're all bundled together in one test. With Family Tree DNA, they're separate tests that you have to order separately and pay for separately. Family Tree, this was that original company that in the year 2000, that first test that came out, it was Family Tree DNA. They've kind of stood the test of time. And 23andMe also is unique in that they actually focus more on things like health risks, pharmacogenomics, those types of things. And the other two definitely are ancestry focused. So at the end of the day, should you order ancestry genetic testing? It's a resounding maybe, right? I can't answer that for you. And it all comes down to what are motivations and and making sure that you understand what the potential pitfalls are and weighing those against each other. Where do you sit in that balance of, this is what it can tell me that I'm interested in, these are the things that it can't tell me or that might be troubling that it can tell me, or here's the risks involved, and where do I sit? One really key take home is, one thing I would tell you emphatically is not to buy this for other people. I am a firm believer in informed consent and personal choice, right? We just walked through a whole bunch of stories about, and you just make the decision for yourself and don't assume other people, would make that same choice. Let them order their own testing. And, maybe not for your minor children either. So, that is for sure a take-home message. But the other point is, DNA is a really powerful tool. Here at HudsonAlpha, we study DNA. We use the power of genomics to make life better. We are all in about DNA. But your DNA is not the entirety of who you are or your identity. That your past, your present, your future, that there is more to it than your DNA. And just to make sure you keep that in mind as you kind of think about if you've had testing and results or whether to not to go in and do this kind of testing. And also just know that the results that you get back are estimates, that they're probabilities, and that they, while they can be really interesting, that they are not 100% foolproof. So with that, I want to say a big thank you to everybody that's here, everybody that's watching at home.